SideQuests 4. Part 1. Yunobo.
Listen, big guy. I don't want to scare you here, but when I'm gone, you're going to be champion. A lot of folks are going to be looking up to you.
Yunobo sat curled into a ball on the deck of Divine Beast, Baridanya, staring mutely at the control unit sitting in the center of the desk. Daruk was gone. He was alone again. He'd known it would happen. His grandfather warned him, even said goodbye to him before the start of the battle. Yet when he'd stepped aboard Redania after the initial victory celebrations, he found it empty, dead. The Divine Beast no longer shone with blue lights. It no longer shone at all, save for the orange control unit, which he thought was shaped vaguely like a bomb flower. Sidon had called them champions. He'd done so before the battle, when he'd gathered the four of them together. Yunobo, Riju, and Teba, with Sidon himself making the fourth. He'd placed his hand on each of their shoulders, grinning and speaking of victory. And then he'd spoken of the possibility of defeat, and how each of them needed to be ready to take over their divine beasts, should something impossible happen. He'd been worried that the monster might try to take them over again. But that never happened. No, instead the monster just tried to destroy them, itself. Yunobo shuddered, closing his eyes. He could remember the panic he'd felt when that creature burst out of the castle and crashed down to the ground in the field just outside. It had been horrible. He'd wanted to run, to just curl into a ball and roll as quickly and as far as he could. He almost had. But then he'd seen that golden light. Then he'd seen Link. And Link hadn't run. He fought. He fought against a monster that tore apart the ground like it was splitting stones in a mine. A monster that held more destructive force than 1,000 bonflowers. A monster that had power over Death Mountain itself. And he'd won.
You're going to be the guy they come to keep them safe.
How? How was Yunobo supposed to be like that? He could barely keep himself safe. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a champion. He was just Yunobo. Cowardly Yunobo, who just so happened to inherit a special ability from his father and grandfather before him. And now he had inherited something else. He lowered his head to his knees and began to cry softly. He wished Daruk was still there. His grandfather never made him feel like a coward. He made Yunobo feel stronger, able to be courageous, just like Link had on Death Mountain and in the village. But without him, and with Link still gone wherever he had gone off to, then Yunobo was just weak.
I know it's easy to get scared, son. I'm scared too. And so is Link. But that's when you got to fight the hardest, because the other guy is just as scared as you.
He sniffled slightly as he recalled Daruk's words and lifted his head, staring towards the broken towers of the castle. Had Ganon been scared too? Had that giant towering monster been afraid of Link, of the armies, of the divine beasts? Shouldn't it have been? Link beat it. The divine beasts beat it. Even that little princess. She made it disappear like it was nothing. And none of them had done it alone, had they? They'd had each other. Link, the champions, and the princess, and they had others too. Others like Sidon, Riju, Teba himself. He closed his eyes and clenched his hand into a fist, pounding it down into the deck of Redania with a dull thud. After a moment, he did it again, and again, eventually creating a rhythm that mirrored the beating of his own heart. Something happened in that moment. He didn't feel any braver, but he felt more determined. Just like he had when he jumped onto Redania for the first time. Just like he had when charging the gates at Hateno Village. Just like he had when facing down that awful Lionel. Just like... He opened his eyes and saw his shield shimmering in the air around him. It was there, its colors shifting between orange and green, just like always, protecting him. But it wasn't his shield, was it? It was Daruk's. It had always been Daruk's. He stared around at the shield around him, which gave off a pale light that lit the deck around him. He wasn't alone. Even without Daruk's spirit there to guide him, his grandfather was still with him, in a way, still protecting him. You've got this, big guy. You're strong, and I'm proud of you. He took a deep breath, blowing it out heavily, and stood. His shield faded, but he knew it was still there, just waiting to be called upon. He took one look around. The 3 other divine beasts stretched out to either side, each just as dark as Redania. He didn't know if any of the others had attempted to control theirs yet. Clenching his hands into fists, he took a step forward, and then another, until finally he stood before the orange panel. And then, steeling himself, he placed his palm against the console, just as Daruk had instructed. He focused on the slumbering giant, on the mechanical beast beneath his feet. He could feel its mind. And then, with a flash, the panel turned blue. The deck rumbled under his feet, and Divine Beast Vah Redania came to life once more. Part 2. Sidon. We should be able to start our movement back to Zora's domain tomorrow, Prince Sidon, Sagan said, hands clasped behind his bowed back. Sidon nodded slowly. That's good. I'm sure my father would be eager to hear about the outcome of the battle. Our messengers should be arriving there soon. The old general paused. But I am sure he will wish to hear it from you as well. And he would like to hear that his son survived the battle, Sidon thought, eyeing the other Zora. Someone who had not spent his last century around Sagan likely would have not seen the tension in his posture, or the way his wrinkles appeared more pronounced. He did a marvelous job at hiding it. Sagan. You've done enough for today. Why don't you go see him? Sagan hesitated, lips downturned into a frown, and then he nodded. Without saying another word, the old Zora turned and made his way down the hill, and towards the triage tents, where the Zora wounded remained. Sidon watched him walk away, and then his eyes darted towards the tent. He could make out Gaddison standing just outside of the tent flap. Irvan would take her place soon, he imagined, even though the idiot should have still been resting himself. Normally they would have been gathered around him. They were, after all, part of his personal honor guard, but Sidon had forbidden them from doing so, for the time being. The battle had been won. He was in no danger, and another of their number needed their presence far more. Baz. Memories flashed through Sidon's mind. Memories of victory over the Hynix, which became horror as he watched the old friends fall before the Guardian's blast. The frantic battle that followed as Sidon stood over his friend's body, suddenly alone and unprotected. And then the desperate retreat from the battlefield, Baz in his arms barely alive. It was a miracle that he'd survived at all. The healers claimed that Sidon had saved his life with his quick action in getting him to them. Yet Sidon felt as though he didn't deserve that praise. It was his actions, after all, that had led Boz to being hurt in the first place. His foolish gambit and desire for glory had nearly gotten his friend killed. Sidon sighed softly and shook himself of the haunting thoughts. He shouldn't be dwelling on it so much, he knew. But the burden lingered. In the last 3 weeks, he'd lost nearly 2 of his oldest friends. And he'd lost his sister again, too. His eyes fell on Divine Beast Varuta. He hadn't yet been able to figure out how to control it. When Mipha was there and explaining things, it had all seemed so simple, but now, well, it just did not seem to want to respond to him. Zelda, who had arrived only the previous day with Link and immediately set about inspecting the Divine Beasts, told him that it wasn't surprising. Controlling the Divine Beasts was different for each of them, and each of the machines required a certain state of mind. And apparently the state of mind that he needed to achieve might not even be the same state of mind that Mipha needed, as if that made any sense. Footsteps on the hill behind him alerted him yet to another presence, and he turned, spotting Link walking up. He smiled and nodded. "I take it your princess is off helping one of the others." Actually, I think Rito is forcing her to tell her stories about her bosa, more than anything. "I was banished from their presence." "Ah, because you are a man?" "I think they just did it because they knew it would get on my nerves. Rito suggested that I might be allowed to attend if I dress up again." Sidon laughed. "Yes, she seems to enjoy that story." For as secretive as they made it seem like it needed to be, she certainly seems to like spreading it around now. "And I take it you will not be dressing up?" Link shook his head, lips pursed. "No. Rito's got a half-dozen guards around her at all times. Zelda's safe." They fell silent for a time before Sidon spoke again. "Have you been in to see Baz?" Link nodded. "I just came from there." He paused, looking at Sidon. "Gaddison said that you took his injury pretty hard." Sidon smiled faintly. "She worries too much. I'll be alright, First Ravan was hurt, then Baz. Now Mipha is gone again. It has put certain things in perspective for me, and left me feeling thoughtful. It seems that life is not quite as long as I used to think it was." Link remained quiet for a few seconds. "I understand how you feel." The two of them sat in silence for a long time, and though nothing else was said, Sidon felt better. Nothing had changed. Baz was still recovering from his grievous injury, and his sister was still gone, but he knew Link did understand, and that helped. Finally, he cleared his throat and patted Link on the back. "So, Link, you must tell me about this princess of yours. I wasn't aware that you and she were romantically involved." Link laughed softly and nodded. "It's a recent development, though not for lack of trying 100 years ago." "And this is what you and Kass were speaking of back in Hatano Village, wasn't it?" "Yeah, I really needed to find out how he knew as much as he did. Buds can be mysterious. In my experience, they usually know far more than they should." Sidon leaned back on his hands, looking up at the sky. "Well, good. I believe Mipha would be happy for you. As am I." "Thanks, Sidon. Actually, that's another thing I wanted to ask you. I know the Zora will be headed back to Zora's domain soon, but I wanted to invite you and the other champions back to Kakarika Village." Part 3. Zelda.
The gathered wedding guests all milled about in the center of town. Many from Hatano Village had shown up, as well as quite a few people from places like New Kasuto. The bride and groom had made quite the impression on the people they came in contact with. They were well liked, despite the relatively short time that many of the locals had known them. But things tended to move quickly in Tarrytown, where new houses were finished almost every day, and they were filled by residents almost as quickly. The town had already spilled out past the boundaries of the rock plateau, with structures being built on the surrounding grasslands, mostly farms and vineyards. New Kasuto was quickly becoming a ghost town, the old dilapidated buildings abandoned for Hudson's modern, multi-story homes. And there was even talk about repurposing the citadel now that the Guardians had all stopped causing problems once the tower in its center had been taken by Link. Zelda felt a little strange standing there in Tarrytown, surrounded by members of each race. How strange it was to see Gorons, Zora, Rito, Gerudo, Hylians, and even Sheikah all gathered together. Many of them were even residents of the town. Such a mixed populace was something that only Castletown had once claimed, and even then it hadn't been as evenly mixed as Tarrytown was. But she supposed that it was just another incredible thing that Link had accomplished during his journey to save the land. Not only had he subdued 4 divine beasts, defeated an ancient evil, defended a town from invading monsters, broken apart a fanatical group of cultists, and freed a princess, but he'd also helped build a new town and fill it with friends from each corner of the nation. He would make an absolutely wonderful king, if they ever made that decision anyway. Even after a month, she still wasn't sure if she was willing to commit to that. Thankfully, most people seemed able to accept it for now. No one asked her to lead them, yet already new settlements were being founded. The Rito weren't pleased about losing so many of their woodcutters, but the Hylians there were happy to lend their services to building new homes for their people. Hyrule was slowly waking from its slumber. In the meantime, though the rest of Hyrule still clung to the last vestiges of summer, autumn had well and truly come to Akkala. The trees had all turned red, yellow, and orange, and many of the forest floors were covered by the colorful leaves. Akkala had always been known for its beautiful autumns, and that hadn't changed, even after 100 years. She looked around for her husband. He disappeared a few minutes ago, hurrying off to go speak to someone. Zelda hadn't gone with him, choosing instead to hold their spot near the front of the small crowd, though she knew few would refuse to give up their spot for them. It took her a moment to find him, making his way back through the crowd. She watched with an amused expression as he carefully made his way around a wide Goron that seemed oblivious to the people trying to see around his bulk. "Who did you run off to talk to?" Zelda asked as Link rejoined her. "I saw Granty. I didn't even realize that he'd started living here too. Pretty soon it's just going to be Robbie and Jaren at the lighthouse." "They'll probably be happy with that, though. He likes the quiet. It'll make getting supplies more difficult, but Tarrytown isn't far. Plus, Pura's been talking about trying to make use of Central Tower's ancient energy for more experiments. If that happens, I won't be surprised if they end up relocating there for a time." Link smiled and wrapped his arm around Zelda's waist, pulling her close. Their wedding had been a small affair, with only their closest friends in attendance. Impa had administered the oaths. She had complained that the wedding deserved a much greater ceremony, but both Link and Zelda had been adamant. There would be enough of a grand celebration soon enough when the 4 races would meet together at the site of the battle, and the 4 divine beasts would finally be piloted back to their individual homes by the newly trained champions. A hush fell over the crowd, and Zelda looked up to see a tall, imposing Gerudo woman making her way through it. People quickly moved apart and allow her passage. Ronson, the Gerudo that had helped Link so much in the desert, had on a white headdress that reached all the way down her back, as well as white pants and a top, all adorned with golden trim and large rubies. Meanwhile, Hudson stood upon the raised dais that overlooked the pool of water in the center of town. He had a simple pair of black trousers on with a white vest. His arms were bare, and Zelda wasn't actually convinced he'd even tried to brush his mop of thick hair. He looked back as Ronson approached, smiling affectionately. Ronson stepped up beside him, slightly taller than him, though Hudson was no short man, and they both looked down at the considerably smaller Zora standing before them. Capson, Zelda vaguely remembered him from childhood trips to Zora's domain, though she wasn't sure if she'd ever spoken to him. Link knew him though, but he'd always known many of the Zora. Capson, aged, wrinkled, and with head fins that drooped down, looked at the pair before him with a serious expression. He cleared his throat and folded his hands behind his back, standing up a little straighter.
"Are you ready to begin?"
he asked, looking between the two intent on being wed.
"Yes,"
Modstin said in her clipped Gerudo accent. Hudson merely nodded. The Zora smiled and clapped his webbed hands together before him. He looked out at the guests gathered around the pool in a semicircle.
"We are gathered today to join our friends, Hudson and Modstin, in matrimony. I thank you for coming and ask that you keep silent until after the oaths have been exchanged."
Zelda felt Link's arm around her tighten. She glanced at him. He had an odd expression on his face. Pride, and she supposed he had every right to feel that way. He'd brought these two together, or perhaps it was the pride of providing them a world in which it made sense to build new lives together. She felt that pride as well. She leaned her head against his shoulder, sighing softly.
"Hudson,"
Capson said, turning his expression towards the bulky man,
"before the eyes of these witnesses, and before those of the goddess Hylia, do you take Modstin to be your wife, to have and to hold, in the good times and in the bad?"
Zelda's eyes were drawn to the small statue of Hylia behind Capson. It had surprised her when she saw that statue erected there. She hadn't expected the town to place the statue in such a place of prominence. At least it didn't make her heart race with panic as seeing the statues once had. Not as often, at least. There were still those moments, though. The nightmares, the cold sweats, the times when she clung to Link and shook until the images in her mind passed. She felt herself beginning to grow tense and tore her gaze away from the statue, focusing instead on the couple.
"I do,"
Hudson said, his normally gruff voice thick with emotion. Capson nodded in acknowledgement and turned to the Gerudo woman.
"Modstin, before the eyes of these witnesses and before those of my ancestors,"
Modstin said, interjecting.
The Zora stumbled for a moment and cleared his throat. "Yes, and before those of your ancestors, do you take Hudson to be your husband, in sickness and in health? And do you also vow to name any and all future children in accordance with the Bolson construction naming guidelines?"
Link began to shake with quiet laughter. "Shh," Zelda hissed. Modstin stood still for a long moment, glancing between Capson and Hudson.
What? You were serious? Those vows are not traditional by anyone's standard."
Hudson looked at her, smiling.
"What makes you say that?" "They're as traditional as they get in this family,"
Bolson joyously said from its place nearby. There was a murmur of agreement throughout the crowd. Honestly, now this is just getting a little ridiculous, Zelda thought. Link was still shaking with barely contained laughter, burying his face in his free hand.
"Think of the future generations,"
Hudson said, smiling at Modstin. Modstin just stared at him and shook her head, placing a hand on her hip. "Oh, all right." She looked at Capson. "I do."
"Excellent."
Capson raised his hands to the heavens.
"Then before Hylia and our ancestors, I pronounce you bonded together in matrimony."
He turned his attention back to the crowd.
"Please help me in greeting this newly married couple. We wish them nothing but the utmost happiness as they journey through life together."
Hudson and Modstin turned to face each other, and then the Gerudo wrapped her arms around her husband and leaned down to kiss him. Link began to clap, and Zelda joined him, smiling broadly. Bolson began to enthusiastically fling flower petals into the air. They joined in the wedding celebration after, and Zelda found herself introduced to a number of people that she didn't know before. How had Link found so many people whose name ended in Son, who were also willing to leave homes and come live and work in Tarrytown? It didn't seem feasible. Finally, they made their way to where the bride and groom stood. Link clasped Hudson's arm, smiling broadly at the taller man, who returned the smile with one equally as large.
"Congratulations, Hudson."
He turned and started when Ronson embraced him. "Sark so, Link," she said, kissing his cheek. "I'm glad that I stopped to give you a ride in the desert."
"Me too,"
he said when they pulled apart again.
"I'm sorry about not having you at mine. It was planned very quickly."
Ronson met Zelda's eye and winked. She flushed. Well, there were some matters of propriety that even she felt should be followed after all. Or at least, Link had insisted, and she'd agreed.
"Where will you go now?"
Hudson asked. Link shrugged. "We don't know yet. We've talked about visiting some more ancient Sheikah sites before it gets too cold. And we're still working on training the champions on using the divine beasts, though they seem to be ready. We'll probably just spend the winter at home, though." Ronson grimaced, rubbing her bare arms. Does it really get that cold, even during the day? Hudson grunted.
"It's not so bad."
Being from the desert, though. Zelda gave Ronson a sympathetic smile. Urbosa used to hate all winters. Ronson briefly gave her a confused look. Casual mentions of people dead for over 100 years could still have that effect on some. But then she pursed her lips. "If Lady Urbosa found the northern winters challenging, then I will certainly hate them." Another man approached Hudson and Link. This man was dressed in much finer clothing than even Hudson's wedding vest, and had a neatly styled black beard and hair speckled with gray. She'd seen him among the wedding's guests, but Link had never introduced her to him. He looked slightly familiar for some reason.
"Congratulations, Hudson,"
the man said with a surprisingly refined accent. He extended a hand, shaking Hudson's.
"Seeing you two brought back memories of my beloved wife." "Thanks, Dario,"
Hudson said.
Have you met Link yet?"
The man, Dario, looked at Link and his eyes widened.
"Ah, so you are the hero that I've heard so much about. The one that put an end to the calamity once and for all. And..."
He looked past Link, spotting Zelda.
"You must be the legendary Princess Zelda."
Zelda stepped up beside Link, smiling politely. "Yes, though please, you may call me Zelda. With the nation in its current state, I am afraid that my title is unnecessary."
"Nonsense. It seems to me that, with Hyrule as it is, having someone from the royal family alive and able to re-establish order would be a good thing. You do intend on re-establishing the throne, do you not?"
She kept her face carefully neutral. "Right now, I am merely trying to gain an understanding on the state of things. As you can imagine, I feel I have much to catch up on. Right now, there is no throne to abdicate. The future, however, remains to be seen."
"Ah, of course. A perfectly sensible course of action. I, too, recently found myself considering whether or not reclaiming my family's pre-calamity lands was a worthy endeavor. Ultimately, I chose to do so, which is why I had Hudson here begin construction on Tarrytown."
She tilted her head slightly. "Is that so?" She quickly thought back to what she could remember of the nobility at the time. "I believe that this region was once governed by... Oh, Rauru, the Earl of Akala. You are a relative of his?" A flash of something that might have been displeasure passed over Dario's face, though it disappeared quickly.
No. My grandfather was never granted a noble title, though he did own a large number of orchards near here."
she felt Link grow stiff next to her.
What was his name? Your grandfather.
Dario looked at Link, hesitating. He seemed intimidated by Link's presence, even more so than by Zelda's royal history. That was not that abnormal, however. Link had a way of intimidating people, despite his usually friendly manner. His reputation was that of legend, after all.
My grandfather was named Alphon.
Alphon? Link asked, voice quiet. Zelda did not immediately recognize the name, though it did sound vaguely familiar. Where had she heard it before? Dario gave him a curious look.
That's right. And he owned orchards near here? In Akala? You're sure? Well, yes. My father spoke to me about them.
Link? Zelda frowned at him. What is it? He looked at her. His face had grown pale, as though he'd seen a ghost.
My uncle, my mother's brother, his name was Alphon. He owned an orchard in Akala.
Zelda gasped softly. Then she glanced at Dario, whose eyes had widened in confusion. This is your cousin? Link looked to the other man, and Zelda could see the similarities then. They were subtle, to be certain, but she thought that they shared the same nose and ear shape, and their eyes were a similar shade of blue.
Yeah,
Link said.
I think so.
Part 4. Teba. Chapter 4. Teba flew in a wide circle above the flight range, watching as youthful Rito flew below, each wielding a set of bows and padded arrows. The padding on each arrow was full of colored chalk. Best not to touch the fledglings with actual weapons yet. That would come soon. The fledglings were practicing formation flying, and taking turns launching their arrows at the assigned targets. A few of them appeared to be good archers, while others were better flyers. Few of them particularly stood out to him yet, but it was a promising batch nonetheless. They flew well together. There was one, however, that excelled. Teba folded his wings against his body and dove through the air, braking just before he hit the launching platform and set down easily. At once, the Rito started flying towards him, each coming in for a landing. They shuffled about, forming into two ranks, side by side, each holding their bow in hand. The student stood still as Teba folded his wings behind his back, looking at them with a stern expression. His eyes roamed over each of them, before finally coming to settle on one particular Rito near the back. Your aim is getting better, but your formations still need work. He walked forward, moving between the twin ranks of Rito fledglings. When you fly back to the village, I want you to practice flying in formation. No racing. If I find out that you've been racing again, I'll have you all flying laps around the lake from sunrise to sundown. Is that understood? The Rito all answered to the affirmation in unison, staring ahead. Teba knew that they would undoubtedly start racing each other, of course, but they would hopefully practice their formations for part of the trip back. Harth would tell him if they hadn't. Good. Go put your bows away and get going. The Rito all started moving, hurrying towards the hut. They would be eager to get home. He'd worked them hard today. As one of them passed him, however, Teba reached out with a wing and stopped him. Not you, Kamali. You're staying with me. The young Rito looked up at him, a flash of defiance in his eyes, though it disappeared quickly. Of course, sir. Is something wrong? Teba didn't answer him, but instead turned to watch the other fledglings take flight. He eyed their formation with a critical gaze. It still needed work. They flew too close to one another. In a real fight, they would end up crashing into each other long before enemy archers got a beat on them. He would probably have to make them fly laps in formation tomorrow anyway. When they were gone, he turned his head to look down at the young Rito. What were you doing out there today? The young Kamali's eyes widened in an innocent alarm. What do you mean, sir? Did I do something wrong? Teba's eyes narrowed, and he reached out, turning the other Rito around to look towards the targets. Tell me, what do you see when you look at these targets? Well, I see a lot of blue. He was right. Each of the fledglings has been assigned a particular colored chalk arrow, and Kamali had left more of his signature indigo spots on the targets than any of his other classmates. He easily outflew and outshot them. He would be the next Rivali at this rate. Teba wasn't about to let that happen. That's the problem. Sir? Kamali looked up at him in confusion. Why is that a problem? Teba bent down so that he was eye level with Kamali. You have been intentionally covering over the other's shots with your own. The young Rito tried feigning innocence again. Sir, I don't... His voice trailed off as he caught sight of Teba's expression. For a moment he looked as though he might object anyway, but then he finally averted his eyes. Yes. Teba continued to glare in silence at the fledgling. Finally, he straightened. Tomorrow before you report back, I want you to pick up more of your blue chalk, enough for everyone. Sir? I said, bring a lot more of your damn chalk. Tomorrow you'll be all using the same color. But then how will you know who is a good archer and not? Teba smiled coldly. It isn't about which of you is the best archer, and it's not about who among you can fly the fastest or ascend the steepest. But if you say one more word, you'll be scrubbing those targets clean after training every day. Kamali snapped his beak shut. Let me make this clear, Kamali. I don't give a tail feather about which of you is the best archer. You're good, I can see that. But so was Rivali. And look where that got him. Last I checked, he's still dead. The young Rita's expression showed defiance, but he kept his tongue. Good, Teba thought. At least he can follow an order. I'm not training you to be the best archer or flyer. I want you to be the best team. You'll work together, fight together, and succeed together. You want to impress others with your flying. Go join the cloud dancers. You can parade around with colorful streamers and sing songs, but if you want to fly with me, then you are going to learn how to respect your wingmates. Kamali's expression remained resolute, beak firmly shut. Do you understand me? The young Rito hesitated, glancing towards Teba, and then finally nodded. Yes, sir. Good. Now go rinse the chalk off the targets and then get home. But Teba gave him a fierce glare, which cowed the youth. He nodded again and then walked into the hut to get the cleaning supplies. Part 5. Read you.
The recent influx of Hylian traders from the east has been good, for the most part, but I'm a little concerned about the prices they've been charging. Riju lounged in her throne, listening absent-mindedly to her trade advisor while gazing at the Thunderhelm, which sat nearby on its pedestal. She should have been paying more attention, but this was dull. It wasn't that she didn't care about it. Trade was a vital part of the Gerudo life. Without it, survival would be a struggle in the unforgiving desert. There was a reason why so many outer tribes often turned to violence to solve their problems. But today, she just didn't feel like dealing with it, not with the ceremony coming up so soon. She was excited to see Link, Zelda, and the other champions again. Her training on the Divine Beast had concluded a month ago, at least insofar that she could control its movements and weaponry enough to get it back to the desert. She would have liked to remain behind and continue working with Zelda on Naboris' repairs following the battle with Ganon, but the needs of her people outweighed her own desires. But still, sometimes it was nice to be surrounded by equals, friends. Zelda's intellectual conversations, Teba's quiet respect, Sidon's enthusiasm, Yunobo's curiosity, and Link's humor and steadfastness were all things that she had grown to enjoy having around. So much so that being surrounded by people who constantly called her Lady Riju was frustrating. Lady Riju? She blinked and focused again on her advisor. Oh, yes, go on. The woman hesitated, glancing towards Buliara and then back at Riju. She asked me to make a decision, didn't she? I mean... She cleared her throat, feeling a blush creep up on her cheeks. Buliara stepped forward. Lady Riju will take some time to consider your proposal. Come back tomorrow morning. But I'd hoped... Buliara slammed the tip of her sword to the ground and the other advisor's eyes widened. She quickly bowed to Riju and hurried out of the room. Riju watched her go with a regretful smile, and then she looked up at Buliara. Sarkso. The older woman looked at Riju, lips pursed. Lady Riju, perhaps if you are going to schedule these meetings, then you should pay attention to them. She squirmed slightly under Buliara's gaze. You're right. I am a little distracted today. She slid herself off of the throne and stretched her arms over her head, groaning softly. She could still feel the other woman's eyes on her, though. She sighed, glancing back over her shoulder. Perhaps I have been distracted often lately. Buliara snorted. I would say so. I'll do better. I'm just... She snapped her fingers, eyes darting to the Thunderhelm. What was she asking me to decide? She wants to add further restrictions on what Hylians can sell outside of the city. It sounds as though some are selling clothing similar in style to that of our own tailors, and doing so for much cheaper. Riju frowned and snapped again. Why even ask? I've given her authority over such minor decisions. I believe she's worried about the presence of a Hylian princess now. Oh, about offending the Hylians? I don't really see why. Nothing has changed yet, outside of a few more settlements popping up. Still, perhaps you should have her tell you her concerns tomorrow. I'm sure she can explain them better than me. She sighed and nodded. All right, you win. I'll pay better attention tomorrow. She snapped again and gasped. This time she was sure she felt something. Lady Riju, what are you doing? Riju frowned deeply, staring at the Thunderhelm, tongue caught between her teeth. Come on, almost. She snapped her finger again, and again, and... Just outside of the throne room, lightning flashed and a thunderclap echoed through the chamber. Riju cried out in delight while Buliara swore, whirling and looking for a threat. I did it! Buliara paused, looking back in Riju in confusion. Her eyes traveled between her and the Thunderhelm before they widened. Ah, very good, Lady Riju. If you can do that without having to wear the Thunderhelm, it could be very effective against an assassination attempt. She grinned broadly and snapped her fingers again. Nothing happened. Oh, come on, seriously?
Part 6. Haya.
Haya pursed her lips beneath her bone-white Yiga mask as members of the clan, her clan, filed past. Most of them wore ordinary clothing and no mask, accustomed to having lived among the Hylians and Sheikah. Exposing their faces to the sun did not chill them as it did her. Still, she would not fault them for wishing to appear nondescript. They were not that far down the coast from one of the villages. Nearby, waves crashed against the shore, the surf still agitated following the storm that had passed during their preparations. 3 ships moored in the cove near the Clarnet coast. The piers had been hastily built, but they serviced her needs well enough. As she watched, several members of her clan carried barrels of foodstuffs and water onto the deck of one of the ships, enough to sustain them on their long journey and beyond. Absently, she thought back to that day, when she'd seen the boy that would kill Master Koga and nearly break the Yiga clan in the process. If she'd known what would follow, the defeat they would suffer at the hands of the Gerudo, the infighting, the breaking apart of the clan, would she have still allowed him to do so? Yes. Her clan was a shadow of what it had once been in numbers, true. Most of the remaining members of the Yiga had gone into hiding following their defeat, but these were strong. They remained, committed to their purpose even as their brethren fled. Some of them had lived among Hylians and Sheikah for years. Some of them even had spouses and families, but that was all secondary to their true purpose. And Haya could use them. Yes, she was confident that she could use them. That's why she'd let the boy kill Koga, the fool. She'd known it was him the very moment she laid eyes on him. His stance, the way he carried himself, it was clear to her that he was a stranger. Koga may have enjoyed lording his position over the Yiga, but Haya knew her clan. She knew each member in the way that only a true leader could. That was why she'd allowed the boy to kill Koga. And now that the fool was gone, she could use him too. Nothing motivated a group like a martyr and the promise of vengeance. Koga was far more useful to her dead than he had been alive. His decapitated head ensured that her Yiga would remain strong and determined to bring Hyrule to its knees. Yes, her plans were in motion. She wasn't sure yet if they would ever see their dark god again. But that did not mean they had to go into hibernation again. Haya's Yiga would not simply hide and wait. They would look for opportunities, strike when advantageous, and bring Hyrule to its knees. A dozen plans were already in motion, and they would have their vengeance. Against that boy and his allies for sure, but also against the princess. She was the last of the royal family. With her dead, the Yiga's original purpose would finally be fulfilled. One of the ships raised its gangplank, and she saw Yiga aboard it laboring to raise its anchor. Others untied the ropes that bound the ship's sails. Haya smiled as the large white sails unfurled and the breeze caught them, towing the first of their ships out of the bay and into the Faron Sea. In the center of the largest sail was the inverted eye of her Yiga clan.
Part 7. Telma.
You know, I once got Link to guard me on the way to Kakariko Village, Telma said, comfortably seated in the front of her new cart. He even saved my life from a band of bokoblins. Todd, her new guard, didn't answer her. He was a grouch of a man with a constant frown, and she wasn't entirely sure that he believed half of her stories. But he was good with a sword, or so she hoped. He had to have gotten those scars from somewhere. Not that it was important now. The bokoblins were far less of a concern than they used to be. They made their way along the road from the Gerudo Desert, traveling alongside the Great Plateau. This stretch of road used to be one of the most dangerous patches on her trips to the desert, and she'd usually tried to find Gerudo traveling back to their homeland to help bolster her protection before making it. Now, however, this road was quickly becoming more popular as most of the monsters that inhabited it had disappeared. Treasure hunters frequented it too, trying to find ways up onto the Great Plateau, as well as searching out the many ruins around here. It's hard to believe that the little guy I picked up at the Dueling Peaks stable ended up being the one that would save us all. She smiled fondly, thinking about the last time she'd seen him. He and that princess, his wife, had been inspecting one of those old Sheikah shrines on the way to Rito village. That hadn't been long after Calamity Ganon's defeat, which she had waited out in the desert. She'd been back to Hateno village since then, but they were rarely home, it seemed. Good for them, she thought, smiling. They deserve a little bit of happiness. She knew from her travels that there were rumblings about what they should do next. Many Hylians appeared to think that they would be reinstating the Kingdom of Hyrule soon, but Telma didn't know anything about that. But then the residents of Hateno village seemed to think otherwise, claiming that they had decided against ruling Hyrule. Telma wasn't really sure what was true. She did know that they'd been visiting some of the towns and settlements, though, asking about monster sightings and other concerns. Perhaps she'd finally get her chance to ask soon enough, though. They would be at the celebration, after all. She was heading in that direction now, intending on cutting straight up the middle of Hyrule Field, something that would have definitely been impossible 2 months ago. It does make you think. If Link managed to do all this in a few months, basically alone, what could he do if he became king? It was certainly a thought. She would definitely have to ask him when she saw him.
Part 8. Kass. Kass smiled warmly as he gazed out over Hyrule Field, though he could still see the damage left by Calamity Ganon's final attempts to save off defeat. There were far more signs of new life. Though some places still remained cracked and devoid of life, other places had already seen new late summer and early autumn growth. And that was just nature's new life. That was to say nothing of the magnificent crowd that set up tents, banners, and other structures before him, or the coming days' feasts and the celebrations to be had, and the songs that would be played. It astounded him even now that he stood just outside of what had once been Hyrule Castletown. What was once a symbol of Ganon's terrible power and influence was now a bastion of hope and life. Rebuilding had not yet begun in the old city, but it was only a matter of time.
"Look at it all, Link,"
he said. All around him, people worked, talked, laughed, and even played, in the case of the children. His own children were among them, happily giggling and chasing Goron and Hylian youths.
"In all my years, I never expected to see something so wonderful."
Link sat in the grass next to Kass, a small yet elegant case next to him, a personal request that Kass had been more than happy to fill. "Things are moving quicker than I thought they would," he said, smiling faintly.
"Yes, indeed,"
Kass said, nodding.
"But after 100 years of waiting, I suppose one can hardly blame someone for doing things quickly. Like marrying a princess, perhaps."
The Hylian man looked up at Kass with a broad smile. "She was the impatient one, I'll have you know. Impa tried her best to get us to wait until the celebration, but Zelda refused."
"And you would have been willing to be married before the entire nation?"
Link snorted. "No, of course not. I would have found someone else to marry if she had refused. Maybe Capson. But, well, how could Impa refuse?"
"I imagine that she never had any intention on doing so. I do not know her well, but it seems clear to me that she cares very deeply for the two of you."
"She does." Link's eyes slowly traveled over the working people, over the children and families, the laborers, the soldiers, the men and women that he had touched on his travels. He was searching, and Kass knew what for. Finally, he found her. His princess. Zelda stood not too far away, speaking with a pair of Sheikah, an old man and a young woman. Kass believed they were discussing ways to properly display some of the destroyed guardians. Link was rarely far apart from her now. Kass felt certain that he wouldn't even be here, if she were out of sight. Even after 2 months of being together, he was still fiercely protective over her, especially when around unfamiliar crowds. He still wore the Master Sword every time Kass saw him, though he rarely wore his shield or his other gear any longer. It seemed fitting in a way. His gear was a mark of his journey, but the sword was a part of him. Perhaps I should write a song about that sometime, he wondered. He would likely disapprove, but he'll also probably tell me about it eventually. "You knew, didn't you?" Link said, smiling at Zelda's direction. "That we'd eventually marry." Kass chuckled softly.
"I believe I even suggested as much more than once."
"True, but that was in the name of being made king. You never said that we loved each other."
"I hardly think that it would be my place to say such things. Your mutual feelings are your own. I could hardly more prescribe them to you than I could tell you of the future."
Link looked back at him, one eyebrow raised. "But you knew, or at least, you knew that once we cared for each other." Kass paused, and then he inclined his head in acknowledgement.
"Yes. Or I should say that I knew the princess bore strong feelings for you. My teacher never knew you well enough to say for sure whether or not you returned them."
"You could have told me." He laughed.
"My friend, I did tell you. I told you that my teacher told me of your bond with the princess.
I believe the word I used was inseparable. Link opened his mouth to retort, but then he shut it, looking sheepish. Yeah, I guess you did. Would you have preferred I say it more plainly and rob you of what I'm certain was a very happy moment? He smiled and shook his head. No, not really. I'm just reflecting on how much of an idiot I was. Ah, you were in love. Love drives us to be foolish at times. I don't think I was in love at the time. I barely remembered her. And I was so angry. Kass reached down, placing a wing on Link's shoulder. Often, it is easiest to be angry at those we love, as they are the ones who can hurt us the most. Besides, I could tell you cared for her. And the fact that my teacher claimed not to know makes me wonder at his own perception. Perhaps he didn't want to admit it to himself. Link hummed his response and fell silent for a time. Finally, he seemed to shake himself and looked back up at Kass. Enough about me. What about you? What will you do now that you've finished your songs? A musician is never finished, Kass said, bending down and opening his case, removing his concertina. As you will soon find out. Link snorted, glancing down at the case beside him, which held a smaller and simpler concertina than Kass's own. An older instrument that Kass had once played. I don't know if I could call myself a musician yet. One day you will be. In the meantime, just practice. I will. Kass played a soft, melodic note from his instrument, and it immediately caught the interest of some of the children. He smiled as some of them began to run up. As for what I will do next, he said, I will continue to do what I love. There are more songs to learn, to write, and to play. I hope to travel more in the future. And Knots will be old enough next year to go with me, I believe. And Amali is going to let you take your eldest daughter with you, and the new hatchling on the way. Kass chuckled softly. Oh, I am sure that she will argue. But I don't plan to leave for such an extended period again. And Knots wants terribly to see more of Hyrule. Well, let me know when you find more shrines. Link's gaze found Zelda again. She loves visiting them, even if the old Sheikah have disappeared. Of course. I will make sure to take note of any shrines that I come across, and let you know of them the next time we meet. More children began to gather, and Kass smiled down at them, meeting the eyes of several of his own daughters. He wondered if the new hatchling would be another girl. It would be nice to add at least a tenor to the family, if not another baritone or bass. Link stood up beside Kass with a soft groan and patted the Rito's arm. I'll talk to you later, Kass. Kass smiled down at his friend. Don't forget your promise now. I won't. I'll pull Zelda away sometime so you can perform for us. Excellent. I will talk to you later then. Link bent down and picked up the small instrument case and walked away, in the direction of his wife. Kass watched him go, for a time, before looking back to the children. As he met their eyes, hope blossomed in his heart, and for a moment it was difficult to keep his own emotions in check. Children. How wonderful it was to play for children. They lacked the inhibitions of adults, the skepticism. They simply listened and enjoyed the music. They believed the tales. They wept when tragedy struck, and rejoiced when good triumphed over evil. Was there anything as wondrous as the unbroken hope of a child? He played a long, melodic note, smiling, and began to sing. He sung of victory, of triumph, of love. He sung of the joy of his friends reuniting after a long absence. He sung of hardship and the power of perseverance. He sung of happy endings, of satisfying conclusions, and the promise of more stories to come.